Perspectives, Finding Common Ground, a podcast series that brings together a panel of thought leader perspectives as a forum to socialize and problem solve education technology issues with the goal to ultimately find common ground.
Hi, my name is Patrick Devaney, and I'd like to welcome you to this episode of Perspectives, Finding Common Ground. Today, we're going to be talking about AI compliance and accountability in the world of education. As AI is so rapidly evolving, it's very difficult for compliance and accountability standards and practices to keep up. So we think we have a very rich conversation here today. I got three wonderful guests that I'd like to give them the opportunity to introduce themselves. Starting with Julia, if you could please introduce yourself.
Sure. Thanks so much, Patrick. It's great to be here and looking forward to the conversation. I think, my interest in AI in general, and sort of by way of introduction, is that I am sort of at the intersection of all the things that I really care about. I am a parent, so I've got high school and college age kiddos, and I'm super invested not only in their well-being, but in children's well-being in general, and how we're ensuring they have purpose and preparing them for the world that they're kind of entering into. I've served as in education communities in some capacity for 23 years, first as a teacher and as an administrator, and now as a consultant. And I feel acutely the lift that AI is asking of our learning communities. And so, super invested in kind of walking alongside them and helping them navigate. And then finally, I've had the privilege of being a learner a lot. And so, I've been to school for sociology and international relations and educational leadership and now, AI governance. And so I've always been curious kind of about the world. And I think we're all sort of grappling with, this is sort of this universal thing that we're all grappling with, right? So my business is called True Nexus Consulting. I'm an affiliate partner of Compass Education. You're going to hear from Claire in a second. And we specialize in AI governance and implementation readiness for U.S. schools. So super excited about trying to find solutions that are sort of at the intersection of innovation, values, and duty of care.
Fantastic. Welcome. Glad you're here. I think next I'll go to Clara. If you could introduce yourself, please.
Yes, thank you so much, Patrick, and thank you, Julie. So I'm Claire Hawkin, and I'm the executive director at Compass Education. We are based out of London and Barcelona, and I sit in the Barcelona, Spain office. The work we do with Compass Education is kind of at the intersection of AI governance, but also child protection and institutional accountability and risk management. So we work a great deal with schools and with education systems to help them build the structures that help keep the students safe while also allowing for innovation to really thrive within the community. It has been an enormous challenge for educational facilities and for all youth-facing organizations in the last couple of years, because there's been an enormous push to bring the technology in, but less of a push on understanding how to manage risk, how to build compliant systems, how to avoid building up a big digital debt tech stack. And so my perspective is relatively simple, that AI is not the problem for us, but the absence of guardrails around how we use technology in public institutions, in child and youth-facing organizations definitely is.
Fantastic. Welcome. I'm very much looking forward to the conversation. And our third, but certainly not last guest, or least guest, I should say, Paul, can you please introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Great to be here. My name is Paul Pasquale, and I actually come to this conversation more from the cybersecurity aspect of AI. Spent pretty much all of my career in cybersecurity in the U.S. government and now out in the private sector. And I'm currently the chief security officer at a small startup called Norm AI, which is focused on making an AI platform more for legal and regulatory compliance teams. And so we think about compliance an awful lot. And so very excited to the conversation. I'll also add, like Julie, I am a parent of children who are seeing AI in many aspects of their life, and also married to an educator who is also thinking about how she can make AI work in the context of her classroom with her students. And so it is often a topic of discussion in our house.
Well, great, great. Welcome. I'm thinking that we have a very, very talented group of folks here to talk today. I want to kind of kick things off. You know, the world of education has an increasing dependency on data, and much of that is private data that really needs to be protected and secured. With the advance of AI, it becomes much more complicated to ensure the privacy, to ensure the standards and transparency are properly balanced in bringing forward the benefits of technology. So as a starting point, are there any particular questions you think that educators should be thinking, should be asking around legality or ethical standards or concerns around student data privacy? Any particular questions you think they should start with? And Paul, you were the last one to mention children and a spouse that's in the classroom. Why don't you start us off, please?
I think where we want a school to start, or anyone that's evaluating an AI tool, is really asking them, how do they view privacy of their users, and how are they applying that? And so there's so many different ways that can be applied. That can be, how are you evaluating the regulatory landscape and complying with all of the relevant laws? Because there's quite a few laws out there that have to do with privacy, especially for children. There are also a lot of compliance frameworks that are emerging for AI governance and risk assessment and readiness. And so have they chosen to align with any of those frameworks? And really, what are they doing as that data flows through their system? From the second they see it to the second they dispose of it, how are they treating that data through their life cycle? That's a very important question to ask. And really just getting those answers and digging deeper with a vendor will really start to help you understand, number one, how serious they see it, and also what they're doing about it.
Yeah, actually, I very much agree with Paul. It's kind of the question that all vendors hope you will not ask is, where's the data going? Because for them, data has enormous value, especially child-specific data that's hard to get by. And I think if you are a teacher on the ground, I would say the question that you need to ask about technology used in the classroom is the same as you would ask if a researcher is coming in to sit in and listen in on your classroom session, taking down information about students, their names, things that they have noticed about them, personal information. If a researcher was there taking down all that information, we would have to ask them a lot of safeguarding questions before they would be allowed in the classroom. We would have to vet their background, where they came from. We would want to make sure that the research they're doing has been through an internal review board, and we would want to know where all the information is being kept and whether it's being anonymized. And we do that routinely when we have researchers come into schools to work with or around children. We need to do the same when we're working with technology, because when the children are using this technology, they're essentially facing some of those same risks. So what is the data collected? What's the purpose of the data? And who holds secondary access? Same as we would ask when we're conducting research in the classroom. Also, can the vendor prove some kind of legal compliance, or do they only actually claim that they're compliant? A lot of vendors, especially vendors that have been quick to market, have a little checklist with some kind of standard language, but often they don't actually have a compliant product. So we need to ask those much harder questions. And then finally, contracts really must bite, especially when the vendors fall short. So who has the audit rights? There need to be termination clause clauses put into the contract. There need to be potential financial penalties, and also a duty to report harms, just as we would with anyone else we're bringing into our schools. So we should think of tech in that same way.
I think the only thing I would add is both Paul and Clara have talked about sort of externally facing questions to ask. And I think we also need to really be looking internally in our organizations as well and kind of asking ourselves, like, what are the practices that the individuals in our organization are engaged in as well that might impact transparency and student privacy and things like that. There's a lot of free tools out there now that it's really easy to access. And so really sort of not only educating people, but really having an understanding of line of sight on what are the practices that are actually happening within the organization that might impact, data privacy and.
So it sounds to me like the safeguards that we should have in place for data, student data, are the same. It just becomes a little bit more challenging to actually track them down when you get the technology advances of AI. Is that a fair statement?
On the surface, I would agree with that, but I think it gets a little hairier. And Clara, you mentioned something that I want you back to is in the past or in the pre-AI days, often you were talking about, hey, we have a system that we've created. And it's a system that you put in these inputs and you get these outputs. And of course, privacy and data security is important to that. And now you have an AI system that it's non-deterministic. So the inputs and the outputs may not always be repeatable. And it looks in many ways like you are hiring a person. And so the way that you kind of evaluate and look at things is sometimes a little bit different because we want to look at things the way they're a machine. And an AI is a machine, but it definitely has more human characteristics where you have to talk more about supervision and you have to talk more about how you would correct behavior. And so it's a little bit of a new place. It's still data security, but how we apply that just.
I agree. I think on the surface, it sort of initially looks the same, but because the technology fundamentally works differently. And I think to just clarify or build on what Paul is talking about with AI systems not being deterministic, at least not at the present technology that we have. In real terms, that would mean in schools that two students might upload two completely identical papers for grading in the very same large language model, perhaps a minute apart. And they most probably will get different grades. And we don't know why, even though the papers are exactly the same. We just know that our systems cannot yet replicate or understand that in an accurate way. And we're still in the early days of testing and doing research on how to get deterministic systems. And so you can see how that spells out as more than just a data problem. That becomes a fairness issue. It becomes an issue that could very significantly negatively impact a child or a young person in the classroom. So more than just protecting data, we are required now to think about AI governance as building a system where when the AI is entering into the classroom or the school, we need to meet those kind of standards that we do with other high consequence domains. So not only pre-deployment safety testing and validation against biases and stress testing for foreseeable future failures or crisis testing for potential foreseeable failures, but also continuous monitoring by a human being once the tool is live, which is something that doesn't really happen in a lot of organizations because individual teachers might have some accounts, they might be testing different systems. And I think a good example of understanding why that is so important are these front libraries. They were very popular in 2023 and the first part of 24, everybody wanted to talk about building prompt libraries. But what happens now is that we're several models improved down the line from when those prompt libraries were first built, which means that a prompt that might have worked really well in 2023 might not work at all in 2025 in a new large language model. So we need those sort of continuous monitoring, continuous updates, not at all in the same way that we need with data, where we can identify vectors and make safety protocols to protect the data. But when it comes to these systems, it really has to be a live part of the organization.
Fantastic. It's very, very fascinating, and a really neat perspective to understand some of the changes that are happening. I want to shift a little bit. We were talking about questions we should ask beforehand, but I guess I would shift into once it's out there, because we're not always going to be able to put gates before these tools are being used. Let's shift a little bit to it's in place. And Julia, you'd mentioned you have kids in high school and or K-12 and also in college. So I think this is particularly important, in that vein. What safety testing and validation should be happening? And what kind of ongoing monitoring? We've already talked about it has to be enhanced, but what particular tools or processes do you think should be in place?
Yeah, so I think things like as simple as I think there's an individual capability conversation there, and I think there's an organizational capability conversation there. But I think first and foremost, there need to be some sort of designated owners of around implementation. I think sort of mapping implementation and understanding where human oversight needs to be in play. Really understanding levels of risk. And I think learning for me was that risk is not really tied to the AI system. It's tied to how we're implementing it. And so really understanding, the way that a tool is being used and what decisions it impacts is a really kind of important component of that. And recognizing that could shift over time if folks are using a tool differently. And really making sure that there's oversight of that. Again, going back to like what you know about what's happening in your organization and how tools are being used. I think about an example of like using an AI tool for feedback and writing. If that the AI is providing feedback that is formative, and then students are using that to go back into their writing and make adjustments, that's different from feedback that is then being used as a grade. Which has an impact on whether students get into a certain class or receive services or something else, right? So those are some of the things that come to mind in terms of that question.
And I could add there with what Julie is kind of mentioning brings to mind the EU AI Act, which I'm sure you have heard hot conversations about in the US. But in the European Union, it is the law already. And it's different than GDPR in the sense that GDPR was really rights-based. You have a right to privacy, you have a right to be forgotten, you have a right to have your data deleted, whereas the EU AI Act is really risk-based. And I mention that because we are seeing a similar approach to regulation in individual states, including Colorado and California, even Florida, that are considering right now taking a more risk-based approach. And the example that Julie mentions about how the risk shifts depending on how you're using this AI is an enormously difficult thing to legislate around. But it is a thing that is possible to identify a trust threshold for within the school, because all you really need is for an AI to issue a grade to a student who then doesn't make the cut for their dream university, only on appeal finding out that the AI graded it incorrectly and there was no human oversight. And then you have a situation at the school that could potentially end up in a significant legal matter. So identifying how AI is used and what the level of risk is, whether it's within acceptable means, whether it's a particular high risk, or whether it's an unacceptable way of using AI for the risk parameters for that organization. Incredibly important. So really something that will be heard more in debates in the US, this risk-based approach. But as I said, it's already resonating with some states, and it could be something that might be spoken more about in other states as well.
One thing I would love to see in, at least in the vendor management space, and ideally also in the law, but we can start with, whoever is evaluating a tool, is in those high risk situations, I really want there to be transparency on how these decisions are being made, how these conclusions are being reached. And there are, unfortunately, a decent amount of tools out there that right now are a black box, and it's kind of a wrapper around a model. It's okay, throw in the admissions essay, and then it gets thrown into a model and out pops your result. And I think we want to push back on that and say there needs to be more logic behind that, right? If we're going to say, hey, this particular piece of student work is graded in a particular way, well, why? What was the specific sentence or paragraph in that admissions essay that resonated with the criteria or didn't resonate with the criteria? And that should all be transparent and auditable and easy for the human to see when they're going back and reviewing that performance. And I think that's really, really important to see.
That's a fantastic point, Paul, and it leads into my next question, really, which is about transparency and how do we not only provide the transparency, but make it understandable for the users. Because it's great if you can see it, but if you can't understand it, it still does no good, right? So how do we make it understandable to people that are struggling just to understand what AI is and how they might use it?
It needs to be right in the interface, right? I agree. We don't want it to be something that's really, really complicated and, we need an IT person to go in there or a security person on it. It should be right there for the user where they can see, hey, this is what you submitted for review. This is what the output is, and here's why, and be able to dig through it. And depending on whatever that is that was submitted, maybe it's, if it's an evaluation, maybe it's question by question, or maybe it's line by line. If it's something that's more formative, it's, hey, you said this, what about that? Right? You need to be able to tie those inputs and outputs together. And my personal opinion is I think that's sometimes where a lot of the lack of trust in AI comes from, is that black box of, okay, I gave it a thing and then I have an output and I didn't get to see any of the work that happened in between. And so we need these systems to show their work to the user right in the interface.
I also think there's some benefit to having, I've spent a lot of time working with school districts around change. And one of the first things you do around change is you unpack shared language, right? And so having a set of shared standards or shared language around, hey, this is the information when you come to evaluate something that you can expect. This is how we test for bias. This is how we, this is the outside entity that has evaluated our system and can ensure compliance. There's just sort of this kind of standard protocol that folks can come into and evaluate because there's some consistency to it.
So built into the training, we should be unpacking this so that people understand not just the steps they take, but what's processing behind. Great.
I think also, the truth is that for schools to be really truly compliant in the way that AI is used, in all the different ways that it's used, from hiring practices to grading students and analyzing game tactics in sports, whatever it might be, it will cost districts and schools quite a lot of money now to kind of reverse that course, because they will need to be compliant, and a lot of of AI technology, unfortunately, is already being used and deployed that really pushes the limit of legality when it comes to certain federal regulations, privacy regulations, student rights regulation, disability regulations, but also individual states are really facing the reality that tech is already being pushed in schools that won't meet the compliance. I think that as Paul says, it needs to be on the interface right then and there when you first log on, and very importantly, I would add, needs to be child or age appropriate. So again, there, if we use the research example that I used from earlier, if we want people to participate in a research study, they have to be capable of giving informed consent, and they have to give informed consent. And often informed consent is something like being read the consent form out loud, perhaps even twice, and being given it in writing, and then being asked, is there something you don't understand? Do you have any questions? And do you understand that even if you consent now, you can withdraw your consent at any time, and we will remove you and your data from the study. I don't understand exactly why we're not using that very same strategy when we're working with children, especially in the classroom, but also teachers whose information and data is making it into the same ecosystem. And I think it's because we're still caught in that rub between pushing innovation and getting this driven into schools as quickly as possible. But the truth is there is a kind of a backlash, and the backlash comes from parents who will eventually put their heels in and are already starting to ask questions about how that technology is being used. And I think when it comes to this breakdown of trust, there's only one way to really build it, and it is through clarity. It is through transparency, as you said, and then as Paul said as well. And as Julie also mentioned, there has to be certain documentations that vendors are not keen to hand over, but need to hand over in order for the community to understand what drives the different outputs, whether it's model cards or data sheets, or whether it's other forms of documentation. And we know that companies are not eager to hand those out because they fear that these sort of transparencies might expose their shortcomings, and they definitely will, but that's the whole point. That's why it's necessary, because schools need to know honestly about the limitations of the tech. It doesn't kill innovation. It helps ensure that trust is growing so that those classrooms are willing to continue to adopt tools because they understand the guardrails and they understand the limitations. So I think that if you pretend that the black box that we are experiencing right now and that is already harming children in the classroom, if we pretend that it is harmless in the long run, that I think that's the fastest way for us to lose trust, along with facing risk and legal issues.
So I'm hearing that it's better to go slow before we go fast in order to make sure that we're protecting the right things. We're behaving in the right fashion. Let's talk about some of those risks a little bit more. One of the real challenges with AI in conversations is that about equity or bias in the models, and it's a real difficult topic to address. How do we address it? You know, what are your thoughts on how we address it? Is it a punitive thing if the models are infusing bias, or is there some more proactive way that we can go at this? Love to hear your ideas on this.
I can go first on this one,
Okay.
but I'm eager to hear what Julie and Paul has to say. I know Julie and I have talked about this before, so she already knows what's coming from me. But I'm pretty hardcore when it comes to this, and I just need to be clear that although tech will sometimes call it a glitch, bias is not a glitch. It is a very predictable outcome of a skewed training data set that have been used in the AI. And it's actually a little bit harder sometimes to spot the biases, perhaps especially for Americans, because much of the data that has been used comes from the North American market and the European market. But if you are in Kenya, or if you are in Indonesia, or if you are in Iraq, you'll quickly realize that the models that are commonly used in the United States are not models that are able to understand the world outside of the training set. So I'm very fussy with companies, because I understand the need to compete. I understand their desire for innovation. But they must be required to audit their systems for bias before deployment. And they must be required to monitor and improve continuously in the real world. And they also must publish their migration plans. If they're making those shifts, we need to know what's going on. And for the simple reason that when bias systems are harming students, especially in assessments or behavior tracking, the consequences have to be real for the ones that are causing those harms. So for me, I would be talking fines, contract terminations, mandatory fixings, public reporting. And I think that is simply for the simple reason that any child's educational trajectory is not an acceptable causality of an unchecked model. So I'm quite setting the standards high for our tech companies, and I think the children deserve only the best of standards.
So from my perspective, I sort of navigate more on the implementation side and working directly with school districts. And so, part of that, I think, comes in that first question you asked us, which was about what kinds of questions do we need to be asking? And I think one of them is absolutely we should be asking vendors about, how are you auditing for bias, and what's the, what are some things and trends that you're finding, and what, in your training data, and how are you mitigating, what's your plan? But then I also think that in our implementation plans in school systems, we need to be thinking about that human oversight piece, and how we're sort of looking at our data, and understanding what decisions are being made, and just having real line of sight on that, and making sure that that we're mitigating from a human oversight perspective around how we're using outputs. I also think that that's got to be a real part of the AI literacy building that we're doing. And making sure that understanding is part of the training that we're providing to teachers and students and to families.
I agree with everything you both said, so there's not much that I can add there. I'll add a little bit that's coming from the cybersecurity side, since a good portion of my career was spent looking at a system and figure out how can I break this thing. And there are biases that hopefully will be fully tested and made transparent. What are the guardrails when something unexpected happens? And that, like, when we uncover an unexpected bias, how does the system handle that? And you should be able to get a good answer there, because there could be something unexpected. I won't call it a glitch, but I'll say, an unexpected behavior of the system that caused some bias. That can happen. How is the tool going to handle that? We're soon going to get to the days of students figure out how they can manipulate the system, just as they try to manipulate like somebody in the classroom that's next to them. And so how does the system handle that intentional attempt to go around what they're trying to do? And so that all this comes back to guardrails. And so, what are those guardrails when something unexpected happens? How do you test those guardrails? And how do you flag if something unexpected is going on? Because maybe you don't have the ability to remediate it in real time, but you do have the ability to say, hey, something weird happened here, and we need a human to look into this as soon as possible.
So what happens when there's a failure? I mean, what happens when something slides through? What do we do? And Clara, you had talked about some kind of punitive things for companies. The question really is, where do we start? Because these are going to happen, and where do we start so that we're learning and progressing, and not just kind of repeating the same reactions over and over, but we're actually progressing as we respond to these challenges.
I think, there's the saying that that regulation always trails innovation, and then I think cars are a good example of that. First, we invented cars, then we invented red and green lights, then we invented crosswalks, and then eventually seatbelts and car seats. But all of it came as regulation trailing the initial disruption and this great new technology. And I think if we look at AI in a similar way, that maybe it's overestimated impact on the front end, but underestimated on the long end, then penalizing tech companies is one approach. Regulation is one approach, but it's not on its own going to be enough for us to get any meaningful safety parameter that would meet the standards that we need in schools. So, we need our educators and everyone else within the school environment that is using these tools to be AI literate, not AI literate trained by OpenAI or Google because they wanted a government contract, but AI literate, really understanding exactly what it is that they are working with, so that they have the capacity to give informed consent around the way that the tool is being used as part of their working or educational experience. We also need families and schools to have sort of clear, accessible mechanisms for complaints, for questions, for investigations that they need, potentially for compensation and for remediation. And I think also that, we need to kind of insisting on understanding how to find that responsibility when something goes wrong. We're still very early days, so many people are familiar with the tragic story of Adam Rainey, who took his own life. And his parents placed a lawsuit against Sam Altman and OpenAI, claiming that this was driven by the technology. OpenAI then has come back and said that it was because the child using the technology had voided the terms of agreement of the technology, and everybody's pointing fingers right now, but we don't have any case law to tell us anything about who holds that responsibility. It's too early. We still need to see more of these things spell out in court. And unfortunately, that happens always on the back of a horrific tragedy. We want to try and avoid as many of those tragedies as we can, which is why we need to not just have meaningful regulation, but also have people feel competent in understanding the technology that they are working with. You wouldn't send a child out on the road at the age of 15 in a Lamborghini driving 250 miles an hour, having never driven a car before and having no theoretical understanding of what it means to drive. We give them a driver's license. We start them in a smaller, more conservative car and until they work their way up to be an experienced driver. And we need to do the same for our teachers, for our parents, and for the children out there in the schools.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I agree with all of that. I think the only thing I would add is we have learned things, right? There are design challenges that we can anticipate at this point, given everything we've learned, everything from, regulation around smoking to social media, right? And so I feel like it's reasonable to hold companies accountable from a series of design principles, of learnings that we can take from a whole slew of implementations. And so I'd love to see us do more of that. Obviously there's so many changes. There are things that are coming that we can't anticipate. And I think all the things that you mentioned, Clara, are reasonable in it, as looking backwards. But I do think there are a fair amount of things that we can anticipate and should be designing for right now that are fair.
I agree with that. One of the things I'll often do when we get into really frontier topics like this one, where we are still learning as a society, is I'll say, what would this look like if it wasn't AI? Let's take that out of the mix for a second. And I think you both said, hey, the bar is higher here because we're we are dealing with students. We're dealing with younger people who are learning, and we need to not only make the environment safe for them, but we need to teach them. And so, like, back to the being on the road analogy, like, what does it look like when you transport students? Well, they don't get in a Lamborghini or an F1 car. They get in a school bus that has been specifically designed for maximum safety. And there are, procedures and consequences and all of that for when things don't work appropriately. And so, okay, now let's throw AI back in the mix. We need to have the same sort of approach. It's not the same. And there do need to be, I keep saying this word, guardrails. We need to make sure we have.
We are approaching the end of our conversation, unfortunately, but I would like each one of you, if you could, comment on one thought, one policy, one standard, one approach that you think we should be looking at and what you think we should specifically be leaning into in the coming months or year as we continue to roll out with AI adoption and learn from this process.
There's definitely been a rise of some governance frameworks that are put out by the industry in the absence of any, very concrete regulation in a lot of places. And so I'm talking about things like in the US, we have the NIST AI risk management framework that came online. Internationally, there's something called ISO 42001. And those are industry standards that someone can elect to follow that helps to put governance processes in place for development of a company, for operation, for a product. And at least in the case of ISO, you can have an independent auditor come in and validate that you've done this correctly. And I would like to see more of that present. It is definitely not a, checkbox like, okay, they have it, therefore they're perfect. That's not the case at all. All that means is, hey, it looks like they've been evaluated, that they've got a system for thinking about the kinds of problems that we've talked about here. And so that sets them up to be successful. They still need to deliver on that, but it definitely helps build confidence that they are being very responsible about how they're implementing this.
I guess for me, I'm interested. I'm curious about a couple of things. One, I'm curious how the federal conversation in the U.S. and states conversation in the U.S. is going to shake out. So that's interesting to me. I think regulation around AI chatbots is really interesting to me in the education space. But I think what is most interesting to me, we spend a lot of time talking about how AI systems behave, and that's really important. And I think for me, the most interesting part of AI governance is around how the humans behave. And so I'm really interested in the human side of AI governance, how we make decisions together, how we build fidelity in our decisions, and how we calibrate as people in organizations that are serving kids. So for me, that's the part that's most interesting.
I find that interesting too, Julie, and I'm so fascinated with the federal state debate in the U.S. and I still feel sure after all this time that will settle into a meaningful solution, because I think the people that vote, that go to the polls and vote, are also people who have children or grandchildren in schools, and we are already seeing that breakdown in trust, because of a lack of meaningful sort of governance and systems thinking around behavior and interaction. And that will come as a kind of backlash, and the public will demand some more action around that. And I think we are seeing that on a global scale. We are seeing a real shift toward risk-based governance for children's environments. Thankfully, because we have already seen unbelievable harm to children in 24 and 25. I am not looking forward to what we will see in 26, but taking a risk-based approach to governing this technology. So Europe has already codified. The UK is edging towards it now. Peru, Brazil, Kenya, Australia, we're seeing it popping up everywhere, and also in several American states that are regulating AI in education with I would say really surprising force, given that there is no federal cohesion. I understand how that leads to a very difficult, fragmented regulatory environment. It would be difficult for someone trying to run a tech company, but in the absence of all else, I think we're better to have some movement than none at all. So I think my recommendation is pretty simple. Treat AI as an institutional infrastructure. So you have to build those oversight committees. You have to require staff training. You have to demand documentation from your vendors and from yourself. You have to document the use in your organization. And you have to audit those vendors as if the students' futures are depending on it, because they really are. And I think that when this accountability eventually catches up with innovation, and it will take years, but we will get there. And I think only then are students actually going to really receive those benefits that they have been promised in 23 and 24. But those will be the students in 34 and 35, not anytime soon.
Wonderful. You have all been fabulous guests, and I want to try to summarize some of the takeaways that I heard. Kanu, the thought behind this conversation is finding common ground and different perspectives coming together with some common objectives or common beliefs. Because if we lean into those, that's how we actually make progress. So just to summarize, and I want you to hold me accountable if I miss something at the end, but we started with questions that should be asked, and there was a lot of expected answers. How is the data used? What frameworks are being used in its use? Who are the secondary access? And how do you provide compliance and audit and report and the penalties? A lot of that are very common. But one of the really unique things that came out of this is oversight or safeguards really have to shift, because this is not just data, but rather it's an evolving or adaptable tool that has to be managed much more like oversight of a human than a system that has specific ins and outs. We talked a little bit about accountability and how we make sure, or how we ensure their accountability. And again, there were some common answers, some common responses. There has to be a specific owner. There has to be targeted oversight. But then specifically, how the tool is being used is far more important. Feedback on a paper rather than submitting a grade has much different consequences. And so the real unique takeaway for me in this discussion was a designation that it really needs to be a risk-based interpretation for accountability, and not what the rights are, but rather what the risks are. And the reactions and accountability have to be aligned with risks wherever possible. Transparency is something that's very important. AI is very often thought of as a black box. So what's really important is that we find ways to unpack how it's actually being used, not just the steps to use, but to unpack that during the process and make that very specific to the user, making consent an ongoing process, and making sure that people understand they have the ability to consent. And that's not just at the beginning, but that's throughout. So transparency really is enriched with that. We talked a little bit about bias, and very clearly, there's a belief here that bias isn't a glitch. The models that are being used are not evolving fast enough or addressing the biases that exist, and so they need to be updated. But there's also other ways to deal with bias. That's through better implementations, better AI literacy, and we also have to prepare for what's coming next, which is students learning to trick the system, as they have so many other systems that are out there. And finally, when it comes to liability, and how do we address liability, there is clearly, we are starting early in the process, but we have things to lean on. We have examples to lean on and other ways that we as society have come through this. It's going to be a continuous improvement. It is going to be incremental, and it has to be comprehensive with lots of stakeholders. but we're not starting from scratch. And so we have to hold ourselves accountable for the fact that we're not starting from scratch. And there were three very distinct things that we should be looking at from our experts here. The frameworks, the existence, implementations, and evolution of the frameworks to monitor this. Also, the human impact. How are humans evolving with the use of these tools and their knowledge of these tools? And finally, leaning hard into, let's evaluate this from the risks, not just from the rights, but let's evaluate it from the risks and make sure that we are maximizing our impact for negative results because of the use of these tools. Is that a pretty accurate summary?
A+.
And I didn't use A+. I did not use AI, rather, to do that. I want to, again, thank all of you. This has been a rich conversation with very thoughtful insights. And I think anybody who has the benefit of listening will walk away with the same sense. So thank you for sharing. I hope I can have you again on the show at some point, talk about how we've changed since from now until then. For all of you listening, thanks for listening, and hopefully we'll hear you again next time.
Thank you for listening. ClassLink is proud to be the meeting place to facilitate these conversations. If you have a topic idea, send it to perspectives@classlink.com. To keep hearing our perspectives, be sure to follow us on Apple and Spotify, and subscribe to us on YouTube.